It was just another ordinary lunchtime at the company headquarters. Employees were scattered across the cafeteria, talking quietly, eating their meals, scrolling through their phones, or simply taking a moment to relax. No one expected anything out of the ordinary. After all, it had been years since the billionaire owner had been seen around the office. Most of the staff had only ever known him as a name on emails, a photo in the lobby, or the figure behind the company's success. For them, he existed somewhere far away, busy with meetings, investments, and luxury events that were beyond their reach. Little did they know, today would be different. Without any announcement, without any fanfare or warning, the billionaire decided to return. He wanted to see the company, not from a corner office, not from the top floor, but from the ground level, among the people who worked day in and day out to keep the business running. He wanted to experience a reality he hadn't faced in a long time, the real, unfiltered life of his employees. Dressed in plain clothes, a simple shirt, and casual pants, he walked into the building like an ordinary person. There was no chauffeur, no security detail, no assistants carrying files or gadgets. Just him, blending in with the crowd, feeling slightly nervous yet curious. He had always been used to authority, to people recognizing him, to seeing the results of his commands immediately. But now, he was anonymous. No one would know it was him. And for the first time in years, that anonymity felt freeing. As he moved through the hallways, he noticed details he had never paid attention to before. The walls, which he had designed with aesthetics in mind, were beginning to show wear. The office furniture, which once looked sleek in photos, now bore small scratches and dents. The smell of the cafeteria, the hum of the coffee machine, the chatter of employees, it all felt alive, real, and raw, completely different from the polished, distant image he usually had of his company. He reached the cafeteria and observed quietly from a corner. People were laughing, talking, and sometimes arguing softly over trivial matters. Some employees were alone, quietly eating while reading documents or checking their phones. Others were in groups, sharing stories, sharing jokes, sharing frustrations. He realized how little he knew about them, how distant he had been from the very people who had contributed to the empire he now controlled. For a moment, he felt almost invisible, but that invisibility allowed him to truly see. He saw the exhaustion in some employees' eyes, the stress lines that hinted at long hours and relentless deadlines. He noticed a woman quietly eating her lunch alone, glancing at her watch repeatedly, perhaps worried about being late for a meeting. He saw a young man helping another colleague with a heavy tray, smiling despite his own tiredness. Small gestures, unnoticed by many, were suddenly vivid to him. As he watched, he also noticed subtle hierarchies forming naturally in the cafeteria. Some employees dominated the conversation, others stayed quiet, some laughed easily while others seemed hesitant to join. He began to wonder how these dynamics affected the office environment, how morale, respect, and recognition played out when he wasn't there. These were things no report, no performance metric, no board meeting could ever capture. He sat silently, sipping a simple coffee he had bought himself, and let the sounds, the sights, and the ordinary movements of his employees fill his mind. He realized that while he had been away, life had continued, in all its imperfections and beauty. And now, seeing it firsthand, he felt a mixture of pride and shame, pride in the dedication he saw, and shame in how distant he had become from the reality of his own company. The longer he observed, the more curious he became about the individual stories hidden behind each face. Who was struggling silently? Who was quietly excelling without recognition? Who was happy, and who was quietly carrying burdens he had never imagined? He wanted to know their lives, even in small ways, because today, for the first time in a long time, he was not the billionaire owner. He was just a person sitting among people, seeing what the reports, the emails, and the meetings had never shown him. By the end of this first hour, he had already felt a shift inside him. Something about returning unannounced, walking in anonymously, and observing real people in real moments was deeply humanizing. It reminded him why he had started the company in the first place, why he had dreamed of creating something big, and why the people who worked there deserved more than just figures on a balance sheet. He was no longer just a distant figure of authority, he was a witness to the heartbeat of his company, and that heartbeat was far more complex, more emotional, and more inspiring than he had remembered. And in that quiet, simple lunchtime, the billionaire understood that today was only the beginning. What he had seen so far was just a glimpse, and he knew that the real revelations, the moments that would truly change him, were still waiting to unfold. The billionaire had never felt so ordinary in his entire life. As he left the hallway behind him and stepped into the bustling cafeteria, he realized just how disconnected he had become from the people who worked tirelessly in his company. Today, there were no cameras, no security, no assistants rushing to clear the path for him. Today, he was just another face in a crowd, observing life as it happened naturally, without anyone pretending or performing. He found a small, empty table near the corner, far enough to remain unnoticed but close enough to see everything. From this spot, he could watch the ebb and flow of lunchtime activity, the laughter, the conversations, the subtle gestures of kindness, and even the silent struggles. He noticed how some employees ate quickly, eyes flicking nervously at the clock, clearly anxious to finish and return to their work. Others lingered, talking in hushed tones about projects, deadlines, and office politics. Some seemed completely absorbed in their meals, savoring each bite as though it were a rare luxury. It was fascinating for him to observe without judgment. He noticed how people naturally formed little groups, some based on friendships, others seemingly on convenience. There were employees who effortlessly commanded attention, telling jokes or recounting stories, and others who spoke quietly, careful not to interrupt or draw notice. Every laugh, every sigh, every small glance revealed the dynamics of a workplace he had rarely seen so closely. He couldn't help but be drawn to small acts that might have gone unnoticed on any other day. A young man discreetly handed an extra piece of bread to a colleague whose lunch looked meager. A woman quietly supported her friend by covering the cost of his coffee, noticing without making a scene. These small gestures didn't make headlines or appear in reports, but to the billionaire, they were far more powerful than any business metric he had ever analyzed. He began to understand that the real heart of his company was not in the boardroom, it was here, in these unnoticed acts of humanity. As he continued observing, he realized how layered the environment was. Some employees smiled easily, friendly with everyone, while others avoided interaction, keeping to themselves. Some managers walked by, checking in on their teams, occasionally nodding approvingly or offering a brief word of encouragement. But there were also moments of tension, an employee whispering frustration to a friend, a subtle frown exchanged over a forgotten task, a sigh that betrayed long hours of unseen work. These small fragments of life painted a vivid picture of dedication, stress, and human emotion that no spreadsheet or report could ever capture. He even noticed how people's personalities shone in unexpected ways. A quiet intern helped someone without being asked, showing humility and care that went far beyond his job description. A mid-level employee cracked a joke at just the right moment, easing tension and bringing laughter to the table. A senior staff member took a moment to compliment someone for their work, making their colleague's face light up with pride. The billionaire realized these interactions, small as they seemed, were the glue holding the company together. Without them, no strategy, no plan, and no profit margin would matter. Sitting there, he also experienced a strange sense of nostalgia. He remembered his early days, when he had worked long hours alongside employees, learning the ropes, and sharing in the struggles. Those memories had faded behind years of success, investments, and the constant chase for growth. Now, seeing the current generation of employees, he felt a mix of pride and regret. Pride in their commitment and resilience, regret for how far removed he had allowed himself to become from the very foundation he had built. And yet, there was excitement in this invisibility. Because he was anonymous, people acted naturally. They were themselves, not performing, not trying to impress the owner, just living their workday. He realized this was a rare privilege. Few billionaires ever get to see the truth of their companies in this way. Most only see polished reports, curated interactions, or carefully managed impressions. Today, he was learning something far more valuable: the hidden life of his employees, the unseen moments of kindness, struggle, and teamwork that defined the culture of his company. By the end of lunch, he had observed enough to feel both humbled and inspired. He had seen dedication that went unnoticed, acts of kindness that went unrewarded, and struggles that went unseen. He had begun to understand that the success of a company was not just about leadership or strategy, it was about people, their emotions, their integrity, and the connections they built every single day. As he quietly got up and left the cafeteria, he carried with him not only new insights but a deep sense of responsibility. Today, blending in with the crowd had taught him more about his company than any meeting, memo, or financial report ever could. And he knew, without a doubt, that this was just the beginning of a journey that would change not only his perspective but the future of the company itself. As the billionaire continued to observe, he noticed a subtle shift in the cafeteria. Conversations quieted, laughter faded slightly, and some employees exchanged uneasy glances. Something was happening, something he hadn't expected to witness. His curiosity sharpened. He leaned slightly forward, trying to catch the details without drawing attention. In the far corner, near the row of windows, a manager was speaking to a junior employee. At first glance, it looked like a normal work discussion, but soon the billionaire noticed the tension. The manager's tone was sharp, almost cutting, as he criticized the young employee for a minor mistake in a report. The words were harsh, bordering on humiliating, and the junior worker's face flushed with embarrassment. Other employees nearby looked away, pretending to be absorbed in their meals or phone screens. No one spoke up. The atmosphere felt heavy. The billionaire's stomach tightened. He had expected to see hard work, dedication, even stress, but he hadn't expected cruelty, subtle or otherwise, to be part of daily life. It was one thing to manage mistakes and deadlines, but another entirely to watch someone's confidence chipped away in public. The junior employee tried to respond respectfully, but the manager interrupted sharply, gesturing toward the tray of food as if that tiny meal were part of the problem. The billionaire's heart ached seeing someone so young, diligent, and nervous being treated this way. He couldn't help but remember his own early days, when mistakes were met with guidance and encouragement, not judgment and ridicule. Even as he watched, he noticed the junior employee's small acts of resilience. The employees straightened their posture, swallowed the lump in their throat, and continued eating quietly, refusing to retaliate or cry. The billionaire realized that dignity and courage were shining through, even under pressure. These were qualities no corporate report or performance review could measure, yet they were far more important than any number on a spreadsheet. The situation became more intense when another employee, who had been watching from across the table, timidly tried to intervene. They whispered a gentle reminder or offered quiet support, but the manager waved them off impatiently. The subtle tension in the room was palpable, and the billionaire could feel it too, even from his distant seat. He realized that this was not just an isolated incident, it was a glimpse into a broader culture where fear, silence, and avoidance often dominated, overshadowing hard work, kindness, and collaboration. Suddenly, the junior employee did something small but remarkable. Instead of sinking under the pressure, they smiled faintly, thanked the manager politely, and returned to their meal. That smile, tiny as it was, carried more strength than any boardroom victory. It was a moment of courage in the face of humiliation, a silent refusal to let someone else's negativity define them. The billionaire felt a mix of shock, sadness, and admiration. Shock that this was happening in his company, sadness for the young employee, and admiration for their resilience. He realized he had been so disconnected from the everyday realities of his employees that he had forgotten the human cost behind every task, every deadline, every profit margin. The people who made the company run were not just numbers, they were human beings, with emotions, vulnerabilities, and strengths that mattered far more than he had ever considered. As the lunch hour progressed, he continued to observe quietly, noticing other small injustices and unnoticed struggles. A delivery person carrying a stack of trays stumbled slightly, barely acknowledged. A coworker silently cleaned a spill that no one else seemed to care about. These small moments, when combined with the humiliation he had just witnessed, painted a picture of a workplace where effort often went unseen, kindness often went unrewarded, and courage often went unrecognized. By the end of the hour, the billionaire understood something critical. Leadership was not just about making decisions or driving profits. It was about protecting people, fostering respect, and creating an environment where employees could thrive without fear. What he had just seen was more than a single incident. It was a mirror reflecting what needed to change, a wake-up call that the company's human side could not be ignored any longer. As he left his seat, his mind was racing. This shocking discovery would not be forgotten. It would not be brushed aside. Something needed to be done, and he knew he was the only one who could ensure it happened. Today, the billionaire had seen the raw, unfiltered reality of his company for the first time, and it was a moment that would change everything, not just for him, but for everyone under his leadership. While the scene with the junior employee had left a heavy mark on the billionaire, something else caught his eye, something quieter, gentler, and entirely unexpected. Across the cafeteria, near a small cluster of tables, a young woman noticed a colleague sitting alone. His lunch tray was modest, almost meager, and he looked hesitant, almost embarrassed, as if he weren't entirely sure he deserved it. Perhaps he had skipped a meal earlier, or perhaps life outside work had been challenging. The billionaire didn't know, but he could see the subtle worry etched on the man's face. The young woman didn't hesitate. From her own tray, she carefully slid over a small portion of her sandwich, a few bites of fruit, and a cup of juice. She did it with such naturalness, as if it were the most ordinary thing in the world. She didn't make a show of it, didn't call attention to herself, didn't announce it to anyone. It was a simple gesture, silent and unnoticed by most, but the billionaire immediately understood its significance. The man looked up, startled at first, then smiled, a small, grateful smile that lit up his entire expression. He whispered a quiet, "Thank you," and the young woman nodded before returning to her own meal, eyes calm, as if nothing unusual had happened. But to the billionaire, this small act of kindness was profound. In one quiet gesture, he saw humanity, empathy, and compassion, the kind of values that no company policy, no training manual, and no performance review could teach. As he observed, he realized something else: these acts of kindness weren't rare. They were woven into the everyday lives of employees, subtle threads that held the workplace together. People who had been invisible in reports, statistics, and metrics were quietly caring for each other, supporting one another in ways the billionaire had never considered. He saw someone hand another employee a napkin when they spilled coffee, another holding the door for a colleague balancing a heavy tray, and someone else quietly covering for a teammate struggling to meet a deadline. The billionaire felt a warmth he hadn't felt in years. For all the criticism, for all the pressure, for all the mistakes and frustrations he had witnessed, here was evidence that goodness still thrived. Even in a world dominated by deadlines, targets, and corporate hierarchies, human kindness persisted. It wasn't loud, it didn't demand attention, but it was powerful, and it shaped the culture of the company in ways far more significant than profits ever could. He began to notice patterns. The younger employees often looked out for the newer ones, guiding them, answering questions, and helping them navigate the daily chaos. Senior employees quietly checked in on juniors, offering advice or encouragement without expecting recognition. Even small moments, like sharing food, holding a chair, or simply smiling during a stressful moment, were acts of generosity that went unnoticed by most. The billionaire realized that these small, everyday choices were what made a workplace feel like a community, not just an office. And then he noticed something even more remarkable. The young woman who had shared her lunch didn't just act once, she continued to observe her colleagues, offering support wherever it was needed. Her kindness wasn't performative or fleeting, it was deliberate and thoughtful. She noticed who seemed tired, who seemed anxious, who seemed lonely, and she quietly stepped in to help, sometimes with a kind word, sometimes with a small gesture. Her actions rippled outward. Others, inspired by her, began offering help in their own ways, and the billionaire realized he was witnessing a culture of compassion emerging naturally among employees, even without leadership intervention. Sitting there quietly, the billionaire felt a deep sense of humility. For all his success, wealth, and influence, he understood that he had underestimated the power of simple human kindness. Money could buy comfort, influence, and control, but it could never create the genuine care, empathy, and loyalty that he was witnessing now. The people who truly made the company strong were not the ones signing contracts or giving speeches, they were the ones quietly helping each other, day after day, often without recognition. By the time lunchtime began to wind down, the billionaire knew that this quiet act of kindness had taught him one of the most important lessons of his life. It wasn't enough to manage a company from afar or to measure success only in profits and growth. True leadership, he realized, meant nurturing humanity, encouraging empathy, and recognizing the invisible threads that connected people to each other. As he rose to leave, he carried the image of that small, unnoticed gesture with him. He knew he had witnessed something rare, precious, and transformative. The power of kindness, subtle and quiet as it may be, could shape a company, change lives, and even inspire a billionaire to rethink everything he believed about success. As the billionaire quietly observed the cafeteria, he began to notice subtle patterns that he hadn't seen before. Beyond the small acts of kindness and the daily struggles of individual employees, there was a larger reality unfolding before him, one that no report, no email, and no board meeting could ever reveal. It was the hidden truth of his company, the part that existed behind closed doors, beyond polished presentations, beyond the carefully curated corporate image. He overheard fragments of conversations. A group of employees murmured about deadlines that seemed impossible to meet, about overtime that went unpaid, and about decisions made far above their heads that left them stressed and anxious. He listened as someone quietly complained about the unfairness of certain assignments, while another whispered about a project that had been mishandled without recognition for their hard work. Each word was like a puzzle piece falling into place, forming a picture of a workplace under pressure, of dedication sometimes taken for granted, and of silent struggles that no one had brought to his attention. The billionaire realized that the employees were trying their best, yet they were navigating obstacles he had never considered. Some worked late nights, sacrificing personal time to meet expectations. Some skipped breaks to finish tasks, quietly bearing exhaustion without complaint. The hidden layers of effort and sacrifice amazed him, but they also saddened him. He had assumed that his company's systems were working smoothly, that his leadership and vision were enough. But the reality was far more complicated, and far more human. It wasn't just the work itself that concerned him. He noticed patterns of inequality and oversight. Certain teams were consistently overloaded, while others received recognition and rewards disproportionately. Some employees felt overlooked despite their contributions, while others avoided accountability entirely. These were structural issues, woven into the day-to-day life of the company, and the billionaire began to understand that no single meeting or strategy session could address them. He had to see it with his own eyes to grasp the depth of the problem. And yet, in the midst of this revelation, he also saw resilience. Despite the pressure, the inequities, and the challenges, employees continued to work with determination. They supported one another quietly, without complaint. They celebrated small victories, encouraged one another, and maintained a sense of community even when the systems around them felt imperfect. It was a hidden world of effort, loyalty, and silent dedication that had always existed, but had remained invisible from the top. He realized that he had been missing something fundamental. Reports and numbers could show profits, losses, and productivity, but they could never reveal the emotional weight, the dedication, or the quiet suffering of the people who actually made the company function. Success wasn't just about strategy or vision, it was about understanding the real experience of the employees, about seeing what was happening beyond the spreadsheets, beyond the presentations, and beyond the polished image he had relied on for so long. A sense of urgency began to build within him. He couldn't unsee what he had witnessed. The hidden truth of his company was no longer abstract, it was living, breathing, and unfolding in front of him. These were his people, and they were struggling in ways that required immediate attention. It wasn't about blame or punishment, it was about understanding, empathy, and action. He realized that leadership without awareness was incomplete, and he felt a deep responsibility to correct the course. By the time the lunch hour was nearly over, the billionaire had processed what he had seen. The hidden truth had revealed both the flaws and the strengths of his company. He understood the human side of business in a way he never had before. From exhaustion to injustice, from resilience to quiet kindness, the reality of his employees' lives had opened his eyes. It was no longer enough to observe from a distance or rely on data alone. He had to act, to listen, and to ensure that his company reflected the values he truly believed in. As he left the cafeteria, he felt a mix of emotions: shock, sadness, admiration, and determination. The hidden truth had been revealed, and with it came the knowledge that change was necessary. This was a turning point, not just for him, but for the entire company. What had been invisible was now undeniable, and he knew that addressing it would require courage, humility, and a willingness to transform not only policies and practices but the very culture of the workplace itself. As the billionaire walked slowly out of the cafeteria, a storm of emotions brewed inside him. The hidden truth he had just witnessed weighed heavily on his mind. For years, he had focused on numbers, growth, and profits, believing that success was measured in revenue charts and shareholder reports. Yet now, seeing the struggles, kindness, and silent resilience of his employees firsthand, he felt a pang of guilt that he had not felt in decades. How could he have been so disconnected from the people who had built this empire alongside him? The images of the junior employee being criticized, the young woman quietly sharing her lunch, and countless others struggling silently kept flashing in his mind. They were real, raw, and undeniable. He had always prided himself on being a decisive leader, someone who could fix problems, inspire teams, and drive success. But in that moment, he realized there were parts of the company he had never truly understood. And the worst part? It was entirely his responsibility. His absence, his focus on the bigger picture, and his reliance on filtered reports had allowed a culture to develop that overlooked human needs, small kindnesses, and quiet struggles. Sitting alone in his office later that day, he stared at the city skyline through the glass windows. It had always symbolized his achievements, the towers, the wealth, the power, but today it felt distant, almost meaningless. Success without empathy, without awareness of the people behind it, suddenly seemed hollow. He remembered the early days of the company, when he had worked side by side with employees, celebrating small wins, sharing struggles, and learning from mistakes together. Somewhere along the way, that connection had faded, replaced by schedules, meetings, and distance. Anger bubbled within him, not at the employees, but at himself. How many times had he missed signs of exhaustion, frustration, or fear? How many efforts had gone unnoticed because he was too busy to pay attention? He had been blind to the quiet dedication that actually kept the company running, and now, the weight of that oversight pressed on him like a physical burden. At the same time, he felt admiration, deep admiration, for the resilience of those who kept going despite the challenges, for the small acts of kindness that made the workplace bearable, and for the courage of those who maintained their dignity under pressure. A conflict raged inside him. Part of him wanted to retreat, to go back to the comfort of distance, spreadsheets, and meetings, pretending nothing had changed. Another part, stronger than he had expected, demanded action. He couldn't ignore what he had seen. This was no longer just a matter of business, it was a matter of responsibility, morality, and legacy. He realized that leadership wasn't simply about directing a company, it was about shaping a culture, protecting people, and inspiring them to thrive, not just survive. He thought about the changes he could make: fairer policies, better communication, recognition for hard work, and accountability for toxic behavior. But he also knew that policies alone would not be enough. Culture was built over time, through everyday interactions, empathy, and genuine care. And that would require him to step away from the executive ivory tower he had constructed, to reconnect with the people, to listen, and to understand. It was daunting, but necessary. The inner conflict extended to his personal life as well. He had always measured himself by his success in business, wealth accumulation, and influence. But now he realized that success without humanity, without understanding, and without compassion was incomplete. He had achieved what few ever could, yet the richest part of life, human connection, had been neglected. And seeing it in his employees, raw and unfiltered, awakened something in him that he could not ignore. By evening, the billionaire's mind had reached a tentative clarity. He understood that the journey ahead would be challenging. Confronting the hidden truths of his company, reshaping culture, and mending relationships would require humility, courage, and persistence. Yet he also felt a spark of hope, inspired by the acts of kindness, resilience, and integrity he had witnessed that day. These were the threads he could build upon, the foundation for a company that honored both people and performance. As he finally leaned back in his chair, he made a silent promise to himself. He would not let this moment pass unnoticed, nor would he let the lessons fade. The inner conflict would soon give way to action, and he would ensure that the company reflected the values he had always wanted it to embody: empathy, fairness, and humanity. For the first time in a long while, he felt that his success could mean something far greater than profits, something that truly mattered. By the next morning, the billionaire could no longer ignore what he had seen. The images from the cafeteria, the quiet resilience of his employees, the hidden struggles, the small acts of kindness, and the moments of humiliation, played repeatedly in his mind. He had wrestled with guilt, admiration, and reflection, but now, the inner conflict demanded action. Sitting in his office, he realized that thinking was no longer enough. Change had to come immediately, decisively, and visibly. He called for an emergency meeting with his top executives. Normally, these meetings were planned days in advance, filled with carefully curated reports, charts, and presentations. But today, there were no spreadsheets, no polished projections. He wanted urgency, clarity, and honesty. When the executives filed into the room, he could see their surprise. They had no idea that today's meeting would change the company's course so dramatically. Without preamble, he spoke. He described what he had seen the previous day: the humiliation of a junior employee, the hidden struggles, the small acts of kindness that went unnoticed, and the resilience that kept the company running despite all of it. His voice was steady but carried weight, a mix of disappointment and determination. He didn't point fingers, but he made it clear that he had witnessed the gaps in leadership, accountability, and culture, and that these issues would no longer be tolerated. The executives exchanged uneasy glances. Some were defensive, others confused, but all were listening intently. For years, they had relied on metrics, performance reports, and financial results to judge success. But the billionaire emphasized that the real foundation of the company wasn't in numbers, it was in people. Without the loyalty, resilience, and dignity of employees, no profit, expansion, or innovation would matter. He outlined immediate actions. Toxic behaviors would be addressed, unfair workloads would be corrected, and recognition systems would be implemented to reward not just results but integrity, teamwork, and empathy. He demanded transparency in management, urging executives to engage with employees personally, to listen to their struggles, and to ensure that policies reflected fairness and humanity, not just efficiency. But the billionaire also emphasized inspiration. He recounted the acts of kindness he had observed, the young woman sharing lunch, colleagues quietly helping one another, and reminded the executives that these were the true examples of leadership and culture. This, he said, is what we need to nurture and amplify. This is what makes our company strong, not just the bottom line. As he spoke, the room grew silent. The executives began to understand the magnitude of the moment. For the first time, they were being asked to see beyond the numbers, beyond the reports, and to confront the human reality of the organization. It was not just about policy, it was about transformation, about creating an environment where employees felt valued, supported, and empowered. By the end of the meeting, concrete steps had been laid out. A mentorship program would be launched to support junior employees. Anonymous feedback channels would be strengthened to ensure everyone's voice was heard. Employee wellness initiatives, fairer compensation, and recognition systems would be implemented immediately. Leadership training would focus not just on strategy, but on empathy, communication, and accountability. It was a sweeping plan, ambitious but necessary. The billionaire left the meeting with a sense of relief and determination. For the first time in years, he felt aligned with the company's mission, not just financially, but morally and emotionally. He had seen the truth, and now he was acting on it. The immediate decision wasn't just about fixing problems, it was about restoring trust, respect, and humanity within the company. As he walked through the halls that afternoon, he noticed employees working as usual, unaware of the dramatic changes about to unfold. He felt a quiet sense of hope. The hidden struggles he had seen would be addressed. The acts of kindness he had witnessed would be encouraged. And most importantly, the company would begin to reflect the values he truly believed in: empathy, fairness, and integrity. For the billionaire, today marked a turning point. It was a moment when observation turned into action, reflection became transformation, and leadership became responsibility not only for profits but for people. He knew the road ahead would be challenging, but the immediate decision had been made: the company would change, starting now, and he would lead that change with courage, humility, and commitment. Weeks passed since the billionaire's unannounced visit, and the changes he had set in motion began to take shape. At first, the shift was subtle, small gestures, quiet adjustments, but slowly, the transformation became visible to everyone. Employees who had once felt invisible now had their voices heard. Managers who had relied on authority alone now listened, guided, and encouraged. The culture of the company, long taken for granted, was slowly evolving into something more human, more compassionate, and more empowering. The cafeteria, once a place of quiet tension for some, now buzzed with a new kind of energy. Employees greeted each other with genuine warmth. Laughter flowed more freely, and the small acts of kindness that had always existed, like sharing a meal or helping a colleague, were now noticed and appreciated. Recognition boards highlighted not just achievements in work but also acts of integrity, teamwork, and empathy. People who had once felt alone in their struggles now knew that their efforts mattered. One afternoon, the billionaire returned to the cafeteria, not in disguise this time, but openly. He walked among the tables, shaking hands, smiling, and observing the changes firsthand. What he saw astonished him. Employees were not only working harder and smarter, but they were also happier. They supported each other without fear, celebrated small victories, and even those who had once been hesitant to speak up were now confident and engaged. The subtle, quiet kindness he had witnessed weeks earlier had multiplied, spreading like ripples in water, influencing the entire workplace. The junior employee who had been criticized during that fateful lunchtime was now thriving. Encouraged and supported by managers trained in empathy, they had grown into a confident, capable member of the team. The young woman who had shared her lunch had become a symbol of the culture he wanted to nurture, her kindness recognized publicly, inspiring others to follow her example. The company, once defined solely by revenue and hierarchy, was now defined by respect, collaboration, and human connection. Even the executives had changed. Initially hesitant and uncertain, they had embraced the billionaire's vision, realizing that leadership was about more than control or strategy. It was about fostering trust, fairness, and a sense of purpose. Performance improved naturally as morale rose, proving that when people feel valued, supported, and respected, productivity follows. The billionaire understood something profoundly simple: true success is never just measured by numbers, but by the well-being and dedication of the people behind them. The transformation extended beyond the office. Employees began volunteering together, supporting community initiatives, and mentoring newcomers in ways that went far beyond their job descriptions. The culture of kindness, respect, and accountability had seeped into the DNA of the company. It wasn't just about policies or procedures anymore, it was a living, breathing community, guided by the principles the billionaire had glimpsed during that unannounced lunch. For the billionaire himself, the change was just as profound. He no longer measured his success only in profits or market share. Now, he measured it in smiles, gratitude, and the quiet confidence of employees who felt seen and valued. The lessons he had learned, about humility, empathy, and human connection, had reshaped not just the company, but him as a person. He realized that the greatest legacy he could leave wasn't the empire he had built, but the lives he had touched and the culture he had fostered. One evening, as he walked past the cafeteria, he paused to watch a group of employees laughing and sharing a meal together. The sight warmed his heart. For a long time, he had been distant, focused solely on strategy, growth, and success. But now, he understood that true leadership meant connecting with people, noticing their struggles, celebrating their kindness, and guiding them with care and integrity. What he had seen that first lunchtime, the hidden struggles, the quiet acts of kindness, and the resilience of ordinary people, had sparked a transformation that went far beyond the walls of the office. The billionaire smiled quietly to himself. The company had changed, but so had he. What began as a simple, unannounced visit had grown into a movement, one that reminded everyone that success is not only about wealth or power, but about humanity, respect, and connection. And as the employees continued their work, supporting each other and thriving together, he knew that this transformation would endure, shaping the company for generations to come.